Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we are going to read a book called The Triumphant Tale of the House Sparrow, which traces the history of this perky little bird from its beginnings in the Middle East to its spread with the growth of agriculture in India, North Africa, and Europe. Everywhere the house sparrow went, it competed with humans for grain, becoming a serious pest. Even so, in the spring of 1852, 50 pairs that had overwintered in a barn were released in New York City. In no time, the bird spread from coast to coast. It was not until the turn of the century, when cars replaced horses and there was less grain to be found, that house sparrow numbers began to decline. But now, there are signs that this clever bird, one of the most adaptable creatures on Earth, may be adapting once more. Let's find out what exactly is unfolding. Behold the most despised bird in human history. You know the one. It's that small brown bird that boldly hops about on sidewalks, pecking at dried up bits of hot dog bun, the one that chirps monotonously and loudly outside your bedroom window. The one you sometimes see flying around inside airports or shopping malls. Yes, that one, the house sparrow. For more than 10,000 years, this bird has lived alongside us and nowhere else, and for just as long, we have tried to get rid of it. Yet, worldwide, at least 500 million house sparrows still survive. So why is it not yet extinct, like the passenger pigeon or the gray auk? Part of the answer is that the house sparrow has always been like us, one of the most adaptable creatures on Earth. Long, long ago, in prehistoric times, there was another kind of sparrow that lived in the Middle East. Like other birds, this one nested in the wild. It also migrated every year. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something in its neighborhood changed. The mammal that walked upright stopped roaming around. And wonder of wonders, it started growing the sparrow's favorite food, grain. The early sparrow quickly changed its habits. It began building its nests in cavities in human shelters instead of in trees near fields of wheat and oat that people were now cultivating. With such plentiful food, the sparrow no longer needed to migrate. Soon, it lost the knack for long-distance flying altogether and rarely ventured more than a couple of miles from where it had hatched, places that were now always near humans. It had become the house sparrow. The early house sparrow built a bulky, messy nest out of dry grasses and weeds, lined with soft feathers. It builds the same kind of nest today, though now it often includes modern materials such as nylon string, shreds of paper and plastic, even bits of stuffing pulled from discarded armchairs. The male and female build the nest together, usually in a crevice or hole. An average of 5 off-white eggs are laid, each splattered with brown dots and dashes. Both parents take turns keeping the eggs warm, and when they hatch, both parents feed the chicks. For the first few days of their lives, the nestlings are offered a constant supply of insects. The parents then switch to feeding them the same vegetarian diet as their own, grains and other seeds, as well as flowers, fruits, buds, and scraps we throw away. A week or so after the chicks leave the nest, the parents turn their backs on them. The female returns to the nest and lays another clutch of eggs. When the second brood is independent, the male and female start all over again. Sometimes, if the weather stays warm, they'll raise a fourth brood, or even a fifth. So not only is the house sparrow adaptable, if there is lots to eat, it can multiply quickly. And its most important food is also ours, the grass seeds we call grain. As agriculture spread from the Middle East into India, North Africa, and Europe, so too did the house sparrow. Over the centuries, tiny clusters of farms grew into villages. Villages grew into towns. Towns swelled into cities. The house sparrow quickly adapted to each new human environment, where it could always find nesting cavities in buildings, plenty of grain, and insects to feed its hatchlings. Except when caring for its young, the house sparrow socializes, feeds, and roosts in small flocks. At the end of the season, it gathers into much larger flocks that can raid fields or orchards. 10 or 20 sparrows can't do much damage, but hundreds, thousands. We humans have never been very good at sharing the food we grow with other animals, unless those animals are pets or livestock. The ones that eat our crops we consider pests, and we always have.
Long before the Great Pyramid was built, the ancient Egyptians were using a hieroglyph of a house sparrow to describe something as bad or evil. So even that far back, the bird must have been an agricultural pest. The Egyptians were expert bird netters, and they would have caught large numbers in grain fields and nighttime roosts. What did they do with all the sparrows they caught? A clue lies inside a 2,000-year-old falcon mummy. Scans have shown the remains of a house sparrow in its stomach. For centuries, mummified falcons, cats, crocodiles, ibises, and other animals were purchased by Egyptians to offer to their gods in return for favors. So many of these animals were mummified. Millions have been found, that they must have been raised for the purpose. And what better food for a captive cat or falcon than a common, fast-breeding field pest like the house sparrow? By 50 BC, the house sparrow ranged from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Sahara to the forests of Scandinavia and everywhere in between. But the British Isles were still sparrow-free. The English Channel was just too vast and expansive water for such a poor long-distance flyer. Ever adaptable though, the house sparrow found an easier way to get there. It traveled as a stowaway on ships carrying legends of Roman soldiers. Along with other supplies, each Roman legionnaire had to carry his own rations of wheat and barley, which he would grind into flour to make porridge, pancakes, or flatbread. Horses also ate rations of grain, usually oats. Both on ship and off, the house sparrow simply hopped between the feet of soldiers and horses, pecking up spilled grain, crusts of bread, and other scraps. The house sparrow followed the conquering army through Britain, breeding and multiplying along the way. By the time the Romans packed up and left, 400 years later, the tiny bird had conquered a much greater area than the most powerful army on earth. Everywhere the house sparrow settled, it multiplied so quickly that it just as quickly became a pest. People caught it with nets and traps and poles tipped with sticky sap. Young boys armed with noisy wooden clappers were paid to make such a racket in grain fields that sparrows were afraid to land. Sparrow catcher became an actual job. To keep sparrows out of their thatched roofs, peasants hung clay nesting pots from their eaves. Before the young raised in these cozy pots could fledge, they were harvested for the cooking pot. There's not a lot of meat on a sparrow, so a single brood was not enough to make a meal. In fact, one old recipe for a simple sparrow pie calls for the meat from at least 5 dozen birds. But despite these efforts to get rid of it, the house sparrow continued to multiply and raid crops. By the 1700s, peasants in Germany were forced to deliver a set number of sparrowheads to authorities each year or pay a hefty fine. In other places, small bounties of a few pennies were paid to encourage people to catch them. In England, records from the 18th and 19th centuries show that millions of bounties were paid, but barely a dent was made in the sparrow population. On the tiny Isle of Wight, for instance, though thousands of sparrows were trapped and netted every year, there was never a drop in the yearly catch.
Not everyone hated the house sparrow. Even today, in cities and towns where people are often unaware of the damage the house sparrow can cause to crops, it is beloved by many. It can be fun to watch, particularly since it will go about its business, eating, jousting, preening, dust bathing, feeding its young, much closer to humans than other wild birds. It can also easily be trained to feed from your hand, and in some places has even been popular as a pet. It cleans up after us too, eating any kind of food we throw away. Bread crusts, vegetable peels, apple cores, dinner crumbs, shaken from tablecloth. The house sparrow eats it all. Even country folk have been able to see the good in it. Observant farmers have always admired how diligently the house sparrow clears insect pests from crops when it's feeding its young. It also helps them by devouring enormous number of wheat seeds in the winter. For these people, the work done by the house sparrow seems like a fair trade for the amount of grain it consumes. Other people, though, hate the house sparrow as much as they hate rats. By the 1800s, despite continuing efforts to control it, Europe was overrun with the house sparrow. It was everywhere, in every barnyard, on every sidewalk, in every market, in every backyard, nesting in every crevice, including between the legs of gargoyles. It was even daringly stealing food from animals in zoos. But in many parts of the world, such as Australia and America, there were no house sparrows. There were, however, new cities in these places that week by week swelled with more and more European immigrants. Some immigrants, mostly city folk, were homesick for the cheerful chirping of the house sparrow they had grown up with. Some people missed the familiar little bird so much that they came up with the bright idea of capturing some in Europe and letting them go in New York City. Surely, the house sparrow could survive in America. It seemed able to thrive anywhere, and perhaps it would even take care of the plague of caterpillars that strip the city trees of their leaves each summer. The first few attempts to introduce it failed, but then in the spring of 1852, 50 pairs that had overwintered in a barn were released in a Brooklyn cemetery. This time, the introduction of an alien species took, and in less than 10 years, all of New York City's boroughs had sparrows galore. People in other American cities wanted the house sparrow too, so they brought in their own breeding populations, or got birds from New York. Conditions in America were so perfect for the house sparrow that it had no problem raising one brood after another wherever it was introduced. And so it multiplied and multiplied and multiplied and spread. Some even hitched train rides across the country alongside livestock. Grain was plentiful everywhere, largely because horses were everywhere. On farms and in towns and cities, the house sparrow snapped up every oat
that spilled from a feed bag. It even pecked undigested grain from manure, and though it turned its beak up at tree-stripping caterpillars, there was no shortage of tastier insects to feed its young. Better still, unlike native birds, the house sparrow was already comfortable living near people, so it had little competition in towns and cities for nesting sites and food. Basically, America was the house sparrow heaven. At least, it was for a while. At first, everyone was delighted. It was just so grand to live in cities enlivened by such a familiar and entertaining bird. In several parks, elaborate sparrow apartment buildings were even built to encourage it to breed, so there would be lots of sparrows for people to enjoy. In less than 20 years, though, it became difficult to find a park bench anywhere that wasn't whitewashed with sparrow droppings. The din at dawn, when thousands of sparrows started chirping, and in the evening before they settled down for the night, was deafening. The house sparrow was also a bully. On the edges of towns and on farmsteads, it stole feed from chickens and drove away native birds. And in farm fields, it did what it had always done. It attacked crops. A battle cry arose. The house sparrow had to be stopped. Pros and cons appeared in newspapers across the land. Name-calling began. The house sparrow was also called a villain, a cuss, a disreputable character, a glutton, and a parasite. It was impudent, insolent, irascible, irritable, intolerable, and lazy. It even caused fires. In Pittsburgh, it lined its nests with fluff from the cotton mill that ignited when sparks from the iron mill landed on them. But wait, said others. They're so cheerful, so frolicsome, so amusing. And the children so love them. More importantly, what would happen if they didn't eat the seeds of weeds and feed their nestlings, insect pests like grasshoppers, caterpillars, and beetles? The American Sparrow Wars had begun. By the 1880s, the con side had come out ahead. Across America, it was now open season on the house sparrow. Over the next 20 years, hundreds of thousands of nests, eggs, and birds were destroyed. But it was like spitting on a forest fire. As the human population continued to grow, so too did the house sparrows. Then suddenly, at the turn of the century, its numbers began to mysteriously decline. At the same time, streets had come alive with the sputtering engines and honking horns of automobiles. Year by year, the horsepower of combustion engines gradually replaced the horsepower of actual horses. And there had been a lot of horses. In 1900, there were at least 100,000 in New York City alone. Streets were so thick with manure that full-time workers had to be hired to shovel paths at intersections to protect the hems of ladies' long dresses. But as the horse slowly disappeared, so did the spilled grain and grain-studded manure that the house sparrow relied on. Over the next 30 years, house sparrow numbers fell dramatically. There was, however, no danger that it would become extinct. In fact, by 1943, when there were almost no horses left in cities, there were still 150 million house sparrows in North America, one for every man, woman, and child. The house sparrow is not the only sparrow that lives and thrives alongside humans. About 10,000 years ago in China, another sparrow began living near the first rice farmers. Like its cousin, the house sparrow, this eastern one evolved to live with people, eating the grain they grew, and nesting in nearby trees, and under eaves and in holes in their homes. The Eurasian tree sparrow had arrived. The house sparrow and the Eurasian tree sparrow are closely related, so it's not surprising that their behaviors, tastes, and life histories are a lot alike. The Eurasian tree sparrow also spread in exactly the same way as the house sparrow, by following the expansion of agriculture. And just like the house sparrow, it multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. It also attacked crops. By 1958, there were so many Eurasian tree sparrows in China that the country's leader, Chairman Mao, declared war on them. He had calculated how many more human mouths could be fed if there were no sparrows. To him, it was obvious China didn't need such a greedy species. Scientists tried to warn him of what might happen if there were no Eurasian tree sparrows to control insect pests. Mao didn't listen. Instead, he told his people to kill every sparrow they saw. Special days were chosen, and everyone stayed home from work and school. Young and old alike rose before dawn and left their homes carrying anything that could make noise. From sunrise to sunset, everyone blew horns, clanked cymbals, and banged on drums, gongs, wash basins, and pots and pans. The skittish sparrows tried to escape, but wherever they turned, there were more people making noise. The birds were too frightened to land. Instead, they dropped, exhausted, from the sky. It is possible that 1 billion sparrows died that year. And the scientists were right. Plague of insects, unlike anything ever seen before, decimated crops across the land. By the end of the year, there was not enough food for China's growing population. In less than 3 years, more than 30 million people starved to death, though the destruction of the Eurasian tree sparrow was not the sole cause of this catastrophe. It was likely a major contribution. After what happened in China, there were no more large-scale wars against either the house sparrow or the Eurasian tree sparrow. But wherever they lived, when their numbers got out of hand, people continued to try to get rid of them. Even so, by the late 1970s, there were still at least 1 billion of these two species on the planet. Then, for seemingly no reason, house sparrow numbers began to fall, a lot. In some places in the world, its populations dropped by a quarter, then a third, then a half. The Netherlands was one of these places, even though this tiny country still had 1 million house sparrows. The suddenness of the drop was so alarming that in 2004, the bird was listed as a protected species. But not everyone in Holland got the message. A year later, in an attempt to break the world record for toppling domino tiles, 4 million dominoes were set up in an exhibition center in Leeuwarden. Somehow, a house sparrow got into the building. It flew around, and then it landed on a domino. In less than a minute, 23,000 tiles toppled over. To protect the other 3,977,000 dominoes, a hunter was brought in to shoot the bird. The story made headlines around the world, and the hunter was fined. The dead house sparrow became so famous, they were stuffed and put on display in a museum, perched atop a box of dominoes. When bird populations crash so quickly, it usually means that most of the young are not living long enough to breed. Why might this have happened to the house sparrow? What has changed so drastically in such a short time? We have. All over the world, we have changed our homes. Old-style thatched and curved tile roofs have always been favored nesting sites for the house sparrow. but these materials have been replaced with modern steel roofing and flat shingles. To save energy, we have also begun to fill in every nook and cranny in old buildings. New buildings have no holes at all. In many neighborhoods, there are fewer trees, hedges, and ivy-covered walls, where the house sparrow likes to roost at night. Cities have fewer gardens to supply insects for nestlings, and there are fewer vacant lots to supply weed seeds. We have also changed the way we farm to produce more and more food for growing human populations. We poison weeds before they have a chance to make seeds. We also poison insects. Grain is now grown in vast expanses far from the house sparrow's urban nesting sites and nighttime roosts. And we harvest, transport, and store this grain so efficiently that almost none is left behind or spilled. We also have more domestic cats than ever before, and we use cell phones that rely on towers that emit radiation, which might affect the house sparrow's ability to navigate and catch food. To top it all off, it used to be common for people to use tablecloth at every meal, and at the end of every meal, they shake off the crumbs outdoors. When was the last time you saw someone shaking a sparrow's meal off a tablecloth? In North America, house sparrow numbers have dropped so much in some communities that it has become hard to find. But unlike in Europe and India, in North America, no alarm has been sounded. The plight of the polar bear, an animal that few have seen in the wild, is constantly in the news. But a sudden crash in populations of a bird that is so common you hardly even notice it, no one seems to care. This is partly because many people believe the house sparrow should never have been brought to North America in the first place. They consider it to be an invasive species. Invasive species are plants or animals that have been introduced into new environments. They usually spread and multiply quickly, often competing with native species for breeding sites or food. It can be extremely difficult to control them and expensive. Unquestionably, the house sparrow is a feisty competitor because it lives year-round in the same area. It usually gets first dibs on nesting boxes in the spring. Even those boxes are meant for native species. If a bluebird, tree swallow, or other hole nesting species is lucky enough to snag a nesting box first, the house sparrow will push out the eggs or nestlings. It has even been known to kill adult birds. But wait a second. Was the house sparrow actually released into a new environment when it was brought to North America? Isn't its environment the same as our environment? The cities and towns we built? Before there were electronic sensors to detect odorless gases, miners took caged canaries with them underground. If a buildup of dangerous gases occurred, a canary would sway drunkenly on its perch or fall off, and the miners would know to evacuate. Because the house sparrow normally lives its whole life in a very small area, it can be a living indicator of pollutants in that place. To scientists, it is just like a canary in a coal mine, except the coal mine is our urban environment. Since the house sparrow lives where we live, wouldn't it be smart to figure out why it's disappearing? What if the culprit is something that is as unhealthy for humans as it is for the house sparrow? Though we still don't know what has been causing house sparrow populations to decline, there's some good news. In the Netherlands and in England, the decline appears to be leveling out. Perhaps in these places, more people are welcoming the house sparrow to bird feeders, or they're providing more birdhouses for it to nest in. Or maybe it has simply begun to adapt to our new fangled modern ways. The house sparrow is, after all, adaptable. For 10,000 years, it has changed as we have changed. It has followed us around the planet and can be found on every continent except Antarctica. It has built its nests in medieval churches, in the riggings of ships sailing the high seas, and in coal mines deep below the ground, where it shared grain with pit ponies. More recently, it has nested in traffic lights, in store sign letters, and even in outdoor barbecues. It has learned to stay up after dark to catch insects attracted by artificial lights. It has discovered that it can control the parasites that trouble its young by adding nicotine-laden cigarette butts to its nests. It has even learned how to open doors. All over the world, the house sparrow flies in and out of grocery stores, airports, and other buildings that offer food and shelter. All it has to do is flutter in front of the motion sensors of automatic doors to trigger them. Then, voila, like magic, the doors whoosh open. If any animal is adaptable enough to survive in our fast-changing human environment, it is the house sparrow.